Hi, everybody, and welcome again to Conversations in Interventional Cardiology. It's my pleasure to have you here with us today. My name is Sahil Parikh. I'm one of the associate editors of JSCAI, and I'm an interventional cardiologist at Columbia University in New York City. I'm delighted to be joined by two colleagues today, Derek Mittleider, a vascular interventional radiologist, and Dr. Matt Finn, an interventional cardiologist down in Louisiana. And we're going to be talking about a very interesting paper that's in JSCAI currently, and it's called Outcomes from Mechanical Thrombectomy for DVT, Insights from the PINC AI Healthcare Database. And Derek, as the first author, is going to present the paper, and we're going to then have some commentary from Matt, and we'll have a free-flowing discussion afterwards. So without further ado, Derek, go for it.
So this is a paper that was presented or submitted and recently accepted and published by SCAI. It's the authors, myself, Dr. Michael Gibson, and Dr. David Dexter. And as you said, it's Outcomes of Mechanical Thrombectomy for DVT, Insights from the PINC AI Healthcare Database. So the idea behind this was that we've seen an explosive growth in the use of mechanical thrombectomy in the recent past. And despite its explosive growth, most of the evidence that is out there regarding its use in the treatment of DVT is heterogeneous. It's almost all device specific, and it makes comparison between the different devices difficult because to date there are no head-to-head studies that are out there comparing the different devices and how they perform. And honestly, as we all know, that heparin remains the standard of care for treatment of DVT. So the study, we use the PINC AI Healthcare Database, and this is a database that comprises approximately 25% of all U.S. inpatient encounters on an annual basis. And the time frame that we looked at was 2018 through 2022. And it encompassed the patients were drawn from the database based on the codes either for, or they were drawn for the codes for DVT, and it brought us a total number of approximately 228,000 encounters. And we looked of those encounters, what percentage of those patients actually underwent mechanical thrombectomy, which ended up being under 4%, or about 8,800. And of those, we looked to see, could we subdivide those who we could actually identify the device that was used for mechanical thrombectomy. And approximately half of those you could not identify from the database which specific device with any degree of certainty. And we were looking for approximately 85% degree of certainty based on the appearance in the charge master, being able to identify the first device used for DVT in these cases. And of those, it was a little bit more for angiojet, and it almost evenly split to the number between ClotTriever and Indigo. And so we have the initial observational data that we presented, and then we did regression modeling, regression analysis based on multiple factors that you see listed here for these patients. And what we observed, so our observational data that we got out of it, was that there was a distinct difference in the three different buckets, if you will, for in-hospital all-cause mortality. The ClotTriever was the lowest, followed by angiojet, and finally Indigo. The use of thrombolytics as adjunctive therapy was also distinctly different between the three groups, where each really was quite different from the other. 30-day admission was not that much different between angiojet and ClotTriever, and was slightly higher for penumbra. And finally, post-index ICU stay was different between the three groups as well, but fairly closely tied between angiojet and Indigo. And so this was the observational data from before any regression modeling. Once we did regression modeling for the characteristics that I outlined, or that were outlined on that earlier slide, there were statistically significant distinct differences between the three devices for in-hospital mortality, 30-day readmission, post-index transfusion, and also post-index ICU stay. And you can see that for 30-day readmission, ClotTriever and angiojet were not significantly different, but for all of the other things that we looked at with regression modeling, there was a statistically significant difference between the three devices, with ClotTriever as a significant outlier between the three devices. We use the charge master to identify the charges that the hospital that the hospital applied to the patients for the specific encounters, as well as the hospital costs for the specific encounters. And from that, we saw using using ClotTriever as the index cost, that AngioJet was significantly more expensive at greater than $4,000 per procedure cost to the hospital, and that Indigo was even more expensive than that at more than $13,000 per index case. So what we concluded from this was that real-world evidence can provide important treatment insights to consider alongside clinical study data. That specifically, we were looking at areas where there is a paucity of data existing, despite the heavy use of these individual devices. That the comparative data is significantly lacking. The results for all the mechanical thrombectomy options suggest that options for DVT treatment may not be equal in terms of safety and resource burden. And finally, ClotTriever showed reduced resource utilization and a lower risk profile compared to Indigo and AngioJet in the sample that we observed. Ultimately, further perspective and randomized data is going to be necessary to either confirm or disprove the findings in this, because this is simply observational and does not speak to the underlying reasons that may account for why the data is distinctly different between the three different groups in this study. And with that, I turn it back over.
All right, let's start back and get into this discussion now. Derek, thanks for presenting the paper, and we're excited to have it in JSCAI. Great job by you and your co-authors to sort of put this together. Let me just get some of the numbers right. So this was about 25% of U.S. healthcare encounters for DVT over a 5-year period, roughly.
About a 4-year period.
About a 4-year period. And it was almost 250,000 patients diagnosed with DVT in that period of time, of which only 4% actually were offered a mechanical option for treatment, which seems like a low number, but we can talk about. If you were to then obviously multiply it by 4, that would subsume the entire U.S. population. So it's still, we're talking about maybe 32,000 procedures over 4 years in the U.S. in toto, out of 1 million DVT diagnoses. So still relatively small numbers, and an interesting time as there's numerous entrants into the space with devices of all different shapes and sizes. So Matt, as a clinical trialist and as a practicing interventionalist in a busy vascular medicine and intervention practice, tell us your first thoughts, and then let's get into the details a little bit.
Yeah, so I was really excited to see this paper, given there's so many options on the market. It's starting to feel a little bit overwhelming, although in general, I'm a believer in competitions. In general, it's I think it's going to create good things for the field, and it seems like it is. And this is a good start for comparing some of those different devices that are currently on the market. And many of these devices are touting thrombolytic-free approaches versus mixed approaches. So this paper does speak to that some. I think that, and also there's very limited data out there comparing the different types of devices. So this paper really is a giant step forward in that way. There's really only one other paper I saw. There's the ATTRACT trial going way back, but that was just with thrombolysis. There's a more recent paper comparing the ClotTriever to the thrombolytic arm of ATTRACT, and that was with the CLOUT trial, and it was kind of apples to orange comparison, but did show similar results to this paper. So everything kind of fell in line nicely with what you were showing here.
So be clear, though, for the audience, where this is not really a strategy trial. It's not really a comparison of strategies. It's just a snapshot in time. And that's one of the limitations of the real world approach. On the other hand, it does give you that real world experience, which if we can distill it and better understand it, it can inform both future trial designs as well as clinical practice. Here you've got ClotTriever, which is a medium caliber, let's say, device that allows for en-bloc removal of thrombus, usually from a prone popliteal access in this patient population, versus AngioJet, which is used, it seemed like in about 2/3 of cases with thrombolytics as an adjunct, using a power pulse spray and then aspiration thrombectomy pharmacomechanical approach, versus Indigo, which seemed like in more cases than I would have expected had also a pharmacomechanical sort of approach. Sounds like clots were laced with TPA and then aspirated with the Indigo system. I assume they were mostly the 8 French system in this patient population. But I don't know if you use unique device identifier codes or how you identify the different devices, because it seemed like there was an equal number of devices that were not identifiable. They were not discernible from this approach. Out of the 8,000, you only were able to sort of definitively identify half of that, roughly. Is that right, Derek?
Yeah, that is right. And I think, the what we tried to do is we wanted to be as specific as possible, that, you weren't just kind of, you saw a few letters that maybe spelled indigo. But if basically our method was, if we could have an 83% or higher degree of certainty that we had a specific match from the charge master, and this was for the first device used. And one of the things that we did is we excluded patients with who had any and diagnosis of PE at the same time, and that specifically was because you could not tell from the charge master what the intervention was first. So we didn't know if we knew that they were using, obviously you're not using ClotTriever for PE, but right. If they were using Penumbra, we didn't know if they were using that for PE as the first device, or if they were using it for DVT. And so all those patients were excluded, but that was the only other diagnosis that was specifically excluded to allow for clarity. But we tried to, like I said, with a high degree of certainty, be able to identify it. And if we couldn't, then in fairness to all of the individuals involved, we wanted to make sure that we were doing our best to present what we actually could say we reasonably knew from right. What had been reported by these hospitals.
Right. So, there's different approaches to doing this. And as we all learn more about this AI approach with big data sets, we'll, I'm sure, recognize that the strengths and weaknesses of these approaches are in the details of some of these techniques. So the headline here is that ClotTriever performed better than the other two technologies and was more cost effective. Now, certainly the fact that there was a mortality advantage is a very attention grabbing headline. Do we have any speculated mechanism by which that might have been the case? And the delta seemed quite large, seemingly a little bit out of proportion to what I would have expected from my clinical experience. How do you reconcile that, Derek? And Matt, I'll ask you a follow-up on that same question.
So, I think that's one of the problems with a purely observational study, is that you don't know. But I think it is potentially the higher use of thrombolytics, which I know in itself is controversial, having, I'm mid-career, having spent a lot of my career using a lot of thrombolytics and knowing that, we weren't killing swaths of people. So I think that is a potential explanation, but it's not, none of this gives us, the root cause of why these differences are observed, but simply that they are observed differences.
Right. Matt, what do you think about that?
Yeah, I would add to that, with ClotTriever, we do tend to take on a somewhat more chronic phenotype. I wonder if they're slightly lower risk in general. So that might have been partially reflected, although these were inpatient hospitalizations. These were not outpatient procedures. So in general, it's probably a higher risk cohort than, if you were to take everyone getting any procedure. But that is one thought that I had, that maybe treating some of these chronic clots was a part of the difference.
Yeah, there's a number of confounders potentially, but I think it's an interesting hypothesis. Obviously, there has been an arms race of these kinds of studies each of which have shown different things. And the sponsors of the trials obviously are touting their own individual devices, but our goal as clinicians is to get to the truth, and obviously find both safety and efficacy that's best for our patients and best match to each individual patient's characteristics. In terms of the next steps, Derek, what do you think will be the right way to use these data for the next series of trials? It's unlikely, I would estimate, that a RCT that's a 3-armed RCT might be done by a industry-sponsored group, but could there be an ATTRACT 2 that would be sort of a follow-up to this?
I mean, I think that really, if we want to get to the heart of this, I think that's really what's necessary. And I think the longer you wait, the more complicated it gets. I mean, you're seeing a flood of also-rans onto the market, and that's not to demean any of the companies or any of the devices, plenty of which I have not used, so I can't speak to them. But I think that, at some point you have to say, we're spending a ton of money, we're exposing a ton of patients to these different types of devices. Do we want to show that one of them is demonstrably better, or do we want to continue to allow these things to exist in silos and only have these kind of observational peeks into whether or not one may be better than the other? And I don't think you have to have 10 things in there. I mean, if you give the example of ATTRACT, you had 2 devices in ATTRACT. One of which is no longer available, and the other of which is kind of probably will be phased out in the not too distant future. So I think that it's something that you don't have to have everybody, but I think you could take the major players and still do fairness to the industry itself.
Right. Well, and in the absence of a true RCT, these are the kinds of data snapshots we're going to have access to. Mm-hmm. And we're going to have to better understand how to use the information. Are there any other clear, strengths or weaknesses to this approach, Derek, that you discovered as you were, generating the data set and reviewing? And are there any statistical things that we need to learn as audience members that read these papers? I noticed there's no error bars on your graphs. I imagine that there's some standard statistical approaches to doing that, but there may also be some new things that have to be incorporated because of big data. What do you think about that?
Well, I think that as far as the data itself, I think one of the most interesting things about this was the period of time that it took place, that we were drawing from. If you look at the 2018 to 2022, you're really like saddling the COVID explosion, which I think is really when at least myself and people that I have talked to at conferences, et cetera, that's really when things started to change, because we didn't have access to things we had access to before. And we also had a flood of patients with diagnoses like DVT and PE related to COVID. So I think that was one of the actual strength. It would have been worse if it had started or ended on COVID, but the fact that it kind of sat right in the middle is one of the things that made it more interesting. And as far as the data analytics itself, as a physician and clinician and not as a statistician, I don't want to get too far into the weeds on that, because we're delving into things that are outside of my comfort zone.
I hear you. That's how I feel too. So, I think that we're going to learn more as we get some of these databases, and we're going to learn a lot more about how to compare these devices and get signals for, I think, safety and perhaps efficacy, but certainly for safety out of these data sets. Matt, I know you've looked at this in a broader context, both for venous thromboembolism from the big veins to the small veins. Any final thoughts?
Yeah, so that's a remaining question, actually, is where exactly we should be targeting these interventions. From the ATTRACT trial, we learned that iliofemoral is likely the best target. And that's also kind of been my clinical experience. But having some new data looking at, specifically the SFA or the POP segments, or even working on the below the knee inflow for some of these interventions, why sometimes we're having higher rates of closure below the inguinal ligament. Some of these questions remain to be answered. There is a an ongoing randomized trial called Defiance, which is going to look at ClotTriever versus anticoagulation. That'll be an important step forward as well.
So, yeah, any final thoughts, Derek, as an interventional radiologist who deals with this a lot? How is this going to change your practice? And do you have any other thoughts for our audience?
Well, I think that the impact on practice is, it depends. I think the fairest thing to say is that it gives you food for thought. And so I think that, I wouldn't come out of this saying that one thing is definitively and irreversibly better or worse than the other. But I think it gives you, like you said, signals that there may be things about different devices that make them more or less appropriate for patients. And we can't sort that out unless we get better data from randomized clinical trials. And I think that this really speaks to the fact when you have disparities of this size from observational data, it begs for the investment to be made to get better data so we can sort this out.
So right now, if you had a extensive DVT in your emergency department and the patient's admitted and you're consulted, how do you decide what's the best therapeutic option for the patient? Just walk us through your clinical algorithm.
So, I mean, the algorithm that I use in my clinical practice now is that if everything's isolated to below the proximal third of the femoral vein, that unless we have a compelling clinical reason, we're not going to intervene unless the patient, overtly fails anticoagulation alone. And there are definitely patients who, warrant intervention below that, but it's not the majority of people. And if it is above the proximal third, going back to the cabin data, then it is something that, if they are, if they're not, if they have the ability to restore some sort of lifestyle that warrants putting them through this procedure, if they're if they're already bedbound, or if they're non-ambulatory, if they're paraplegic, if there are things like that where that even if you get a great venographic result, it's probably not going to be durable. If they don't fall into those camps, then we will intervene. And at my institution, we do use multiple devices. In my practice, the majority of the time, I am, but not exclusively, but I am using ClotTriever, and I'm usually using ClotTriever Bold, which honestly is not included in this data set at all, just like the Penumbra Flash 16 is not included in this data at all. So the things that I and my partners are using now are not in this data bundle. The manufacturers are, but the most contemporary devices are not.
Yeah, that's great. I think for the clinicians at home, I think that's the most useful part of this. It's to recognize that the data influence your decision some, but you recognize that the technology has already outstripped the data that we've already gathered. So with that, I want to thank both of you for your time and for being with us tonight for this discussion. We've always found that these kinds of papers are thought-provoking and will hopefully be followed up by more hypothesis-driven science based on the hypotheses that are generated here. So thank you guys for being with us, and thanks to all of you for listening. And we look forward to seeing you more in the future for conversations in interventional cardiology. Thanks again.